to enjoy the lunch. So I'm Alan Jones, Director of the Global Sustainability Institute. So this is the fourth in the series, second one that we're hosting in Chelmsford. And not to take any bit of your time before handing over to our speaker, delighted that we can welcome Robert to give us a talk on the politics of energy. Be able to say a little bit about your
Oh, right, okay, I will, thank you. Thank you very much, Eric. Fine. I was going to suggest you've got close because I've just shaken off a head cold, which has left me with ringing in the ears. So when we argue later and you're at the back, I won't be able to hear what you're saying, but never mind. When I do this sort of thing nowadays, I'm reminded of a T.S. Eliot poem, The Love Song of Alfred J. Prufrock. I don't know, in which there's a biblical quote there. He says, "I am Lazarus, come back from the dead, come back to tell you all." So that's how I feel, because I've been in this business rather a long time. And 2 weeks ago I was doing a similar seminar on education policy with a lot of young politicians. And when I got home, my wife said, "You know, the reason you were getting blank looks then," she said, "is because when you mentioned some legislation, nobody in that audience was born." So if I do take you far back in the past, you know, I apologize. No, I don't apologize. I think you ought to know. But I thought it would be quite useful to talk about how energy policy is made, and then have 4 or 5 illustrative case histories of where it's all gone wrong in the past. And as Alid had said, I'd better tell you who I am. Tony Benn appointed me to his Advisory Council on Energy Conservation, ACBE, in 1982. I even have to have notes to remind me of the dates. And in 1991, Heseltine and Peter Lilly appointed me to their advisory committee on business and environment. So I have been advising government since about 1982, with many other committees and so forth. As I was telling one of your leaders, I was on a committee which had fuel industry people, and everybody seemed to come from Pembroke in Cambridge. And I said to the Humphrey, I said, "Good heavens, what's wrong? There's so many of us from Pembroke." And he said, with his haughty, he said, "Oh, surely no government advisory committee is of any worth unless it has at least 3 or 4 Pembroke men on it." You know? And I didn't know whether he was pulling my leg or not. But I have been in this for quite a long time. Apart from government, I've also advised the CBI, who set up their energy unit years ago. I was a founder member of the RIBA, that's the Royal Institute of British Architects, energy group, which became a very powerful body for about 20 years in energy, because people quickly caught on energy conservation, that most energy is used in buildings, you know, and that was important. And I've also advised a number of universities. I'm rather proud of the fact that when one of the Oxford universities asked me to advise them, I better not tell you the name of their Vice-Chancellor because he's a very big name in energy conservation, but I was going there and they rang me up and said, "We've reserved a car park for you." And I thought, and I said to them, "How on earth, you've got perfect park and ride in Oxford, and yet you go and offer me a parking place right in the middle?" So that got us off to a bad start, but I thought it was a point worth making. And to avoid a sort of 4-hour lecture, because there is a lot in that, I'm going to select 4 things to talk about on energy. First of all is the dissolution of the Advisory Council on Energy Conservation by Mrs. Thatcher, and the dissolution of the Energy Commission at that time. I'm then going to talk about the Energy Saving Trust, which some of you have heard about. I'm selecting energy conservation things because I suddenly realised that this is a sustainability outfit. And so I will keep off other energy policy. It will be mostly energy conservation. I'm therefore then going to talk about energy action cities, which that became quite a fiasco. And then, to bring us up to date, I'm going to talk about what I call the farcical story of the smart meters. You know, and we might come on to Green Deal and all that. Now, energy policy, what it ought to be about availability, security of supply, affordability, and so forth. And over the recent years, by that I mean 30, 40 years, it's come to involve global warming, pollution, and that sort of thing. And the big catch for a lot of governments is fuel poverty. But now I think we'll find as I talk things have changed. Because there are three key elements for making energy policy, which I suggest to you, which I'll talk about. And these can be summed up as complexity, cupidity, and what I term the Dobson terror, which you would never heard of, but you'll hear about in a few moments, and I want you to keep it in mind. Now, most political issues are complex, but the reason I say you've got to realise there's complexity in energy policy is because when I got mixed up in this, it was rather amusing. I was working for British Gas at the time, and the board member in marketing had called me into his office, and he was a dear old time-served gas engineer. I'm not an engineer, I'm a humanities man, so I can say that. And he was sitting there with his tie off, looking dreadful, and he said, "Come in, lad." You know, I was only about 50 at the time, so he was still calling you lad. It's 1977. And he said, "Energy conservation is one bloody great hole after another." You know, and he said, "You've got to set up a team to get me out of the next hole." Because I ran a team at the time which he laughingly called the curly thinkers. I never knew whether that was an insult or whether it was a compliment, but he was a time-served gas engineer, so I thought anybody who has something more than O-level was a curly thinker. But that was in 1977, and when I handed over in 1993, that group was spending £15 million a year on energy conservation in government. You know, to as one of my younger daughters said, to suborn Her Majesty's government. And I think that gives you some idea of how much money, but the complexity comes in because I set my staff on finding out what influences policy in energy conservation. And they discovered that there were at least 70 organisations at the time, 70, in the United Kingdom, concerned with advising and inputting into energy policy. It's extraordinary. It gave me such a shock that through the RIBA, that you won't be able to get this unless you... I wrote this book called What's What in Energy Conservation to try and explain it all. And inside it, you'll find a diagram which Tony Benn called the underground railway map. And I'll leave that around in case some of you want it. But it gives you some idea of how complex energy policy is, that you can have 70 organisations, and that's just some of the official government ones inputting it. And Tony Benn said that he put a hole through his copy of that and hung it on his desk. He said, because when I took over this, I hadn't a bloody clue what was going on. But just imagine that having to... So if you're going to study energy policy in any way, I would recommend that you do a study into the complexity of it. Do postgraduates still read Stafford Beer on managing complexity? Or am I being terribly out of date? I obviously am. This will be one of the occasions where my wife says they weren't even born when I said. But he was the chap who fell foul when Allende was slung out in Chile. Do you remember? Am I going too far back in history on that? But anyway, Stafford Beer, a great admirer of him, he wrote a lot of books on managing complexity, so it is complex. Now, coming on that's complexity, cupidity. The second rule of studying energy politics is cupidity, because if there are two words which sum up how to understand energy policy, it's the Latin tag cui bono, which I translate as who the hell's making a killing. because that tells you why the policy works. Because in energy, we account in millions to start with and quickly move on to billions. And as we pass on, you'll find out why I say that cupidity is the basis of energy policy. And now we come on to the Dobson terror. Now I want you to remember the Dobson terror. The Dobson I'm talking about is a guy called Frank Dobson, who was the shadow energy secretary when Thatcher was in power, before Tony Blair came in. And I went to a conference by the Policy Studies Institute in London. And Frank Dobson stood up, and I have to quote this, he said, "Real effective energy conservation means that collectively the energy suppliers have to sell less tomorrow, less of their products than they do today." And all the energy suppliers at that conference froze, and the people who really believed in energy conservation cheered. Now the fact he didn't get the energy portfolio when Blair came to power is very interesting, because we all thought he would. And then many of us realised that he had said the unthinkable, because no business thrives on a declining market. Once you see your market declining, that's the time to get out or think of something else. And he had actually said, if you're going to have energy conservation, everybody must sell less energy. I suspect that Sarkozy, to bring things right up to date, could be in trouble, because in his presidential manifesto, I was reading this the other day, I spend about a third of my time in France, and he has put in train legislation with objectives of actually cutting the amount of energy used by government departments and départements. He's not saying you must increase your efficiency by such a percentage, he's actually said there's got to be less sold. He's been cheered because the left is quite strong there, but I think if he were to get back in, he's going to have trouble with the energy suppliers. Though, as we'll come on to later, he's quite lucky because most of the energy suppliers in France are publicly owned. And they just own our energy now as well. We'll come on to that later. So that's why I call it the Dobson terror, because whenever you mention that sort of thing to gas, electricity, oil, coal, they go into collapse, really. Right, let's come on to the first examples of how this cupidity works. The Advisory Council for Energy Conservation and the Energy Commission. How many people had ever heard of the Energy Commission? No, nobody knows about this. This was set up by Eric Varley in 1974 to bring all the energy industries, that meant all the suppliers and so forth, together to create an energy policy. And you won't know about this, but they produced a document which had a great big graph, and it had what we were talking about in that time called the energy gap. They'd worked out that in about the 80s or 90s, the United Kingdom was actually going to run out of energy. And that's why the Save It campaign, which was highly successful under Ben, came into being. Because the policy then was known as Cocoa Nuke. You must have heard of that one. It was coal, conservation, and nuclear. That's what the United Kingdom was going to survive on. But the projections showed this great energy gap coming, and it was welcomed, that they did that. But of course, we were saved by gas. About that time, they discovered gas in the North Sea, and that started saving it. But at the same time, when Varley set up the Advisory Council on Energy Conservation, we were going strongly until Mrs. Thatcher arrived. And within about 2 weeks of the new government coming in, we were sitting deliberating energy conservation when a Humphrey was sent from the Cabinet Office. And we were all terribly impressed, because if you know how policy is made, to actually get a visitation from the Cabinet Office means you're terribly important. But we were horrified that we were told that the Prime Minister wants you to change your name. Instead of being called the Advisory Council for Energy Conservation, we were to be called the Advisory Council for Energy Efficiency. And so we accepted that. A couple of weeks later, this guy came back again. And he said, there has been another change. He said, you're now to call yourself not energy efficiency, but you must talk about cost-effective energy efficiency. You know, energy conservation was going around. And then about a month after that, we were disbanded. And Mrs. Thatcher set up her energy efficiency champions, which were 4 men from industries she liked, who were supposed to deal with energy efficiency. And I'm pleased to say that within a year, they just disappeared off the map, you know, because they couldn't do it. But why did she do that? The reason she did that is because she was about to privatise the electricity and gas industries. And you can't sell an industry profitably if you're going to say that its market is going to shrink. So that's why energy conservation disappeared off the scene once the Tory government came in. I know it just disappeared. You know, everything was stopped. And the reason for that is, as I said, cui bono, who's going to make the money? And if you don't believe that that works, last year there was a 15% drop in demand for gas, for petrol and diesel in the United Kingdom. And one of the latest surveys has shown that 11% of private motorists say they are going to drive less this year. And remember, you know the Corrytown refinery, just over the way here, which has been in trouble because Petroplus, the owners from Switzerland, have gone broke. And the reason, it says, is falling demand. So that's ought to illustrate why in energy policy, energy suppliers are scared to death of what I call the Dobson terror. You know, because energy, if you cut down the amount of energy use, they go out of business. The next thing I was going to talk about is the Energy Saving Trust. Now, you all know about the Energy Saving Trust, don't you? Because it still exists. Right. I've got... yes, I will read this. I'm sorry, I've given myself the odd notes of quotes. When I wrote about the Energy Saving Trust, I said, as an exercise in understanding the politics of energy conservation in the UK, the Energy Saving Trust must rank as one of the most valuable lessons in complexity, conflict, confusion, political manipulation, lost opportunity and wasted resources. Sorry, that was my opinion of the Energy Saving Trust. It all stems from fuel poverty, which you'll want to talk about later, I should think. I'm going to be careful because, as I say, I don't want to give a 4-hour chat on energy policy. But back in about 1990, a thing called the E factor was imposed on the gas industry. Is that still in the minds of energy conservation people? No. The idea was that for every therm of gas that was sold, so much money had to be put into this pot to be spent on fuel poverty. And British Gas wanted to increase that to a lot more than it was because we knew, I was still working with British Gas then, that fuel poverty was a good way of selling gas and penalising the electricians. Because in those days there used to be competition in the energy market. There isn't now. There is no competition in the energy market, which you might want to talk about later. But British Gas wanted to spend money, but they didn't trust the government to use that money for fuel poverty. And the government didn't trust British Gas to use it for fuel poverty and not use it for marketing purposes. So you had distrust, which you always get. And my department came up with a brilliant idea, I thought at the time, and still do, of setting up a trust where British Gas would pay about 20 or 30 million a year, say, into a trust, which could then be used for spending on alleviating fuel poverty. And then British Gas wouldn't have control of it, and the government couldn't get its little sticky fingers on it. And it was going to be set up very cheaply. You know, that it was not a policy-making thing. It would have been very cheaply run with a middle management paid executive, premises probably in North London or somewhere. But it was just going to go ahead when the Tory government in, 1992, there was an election coming up, and they discovered that they had nothing in their manifesto on fuel poverty. You know, and the papers were shouting about it. So John Wakeman was then the minister. He came to see my chairman, who by that time was a privatised chairman, so he was quite sympathetic to the Tory government. And quite literally over the weekend, this happened on the Friday, and it was announced on the Monday, that the Energy Saving Trust, which we were set up, would become a government initiative. Just like that. And what annoys me, and this is on energy policy, by the time this was set up, instead of being a cheap organisation to do this job, they appointed a noble lord as chairman, with a little retainer in those days of about 24,000 a year. They decided to set up their office in Buckingham Palace Road, beautiful offices instead of North London, and it became a sort of a business, you know, these sort of people in. Because I was advised at the time by Lord Ezra, who's a Liberal Democrat man on energy conservation, that you really didn't have to pay the chairman of this trust. People would be honoured to be on it, and you wouldn't have to pay the board. But once the Tory government got their little fingers on it, the costs soared enormously. And that's why today, the Energy Saving Trust is really a pain in the butt for energy conservation people, because all it's trying to do is drag projects into itself, top slice them to pay all these vast salaries, and very little energy conservation gets done. And that is a classic example, I think, in the politics of energy, of governments getting their sticky fingers on it and somebody thinking they can make some money out of it. I was then going to talk about energy action areas. Do you all know about energy action areas? Under Ben and Varley years ago, the idea was to set up towns, cities and all that with energy conservation limits and so forth. The EU was looking for what they called a discrete, substantial settlement to study energy, and they noticed the Isle of Wight, just off the south coast of England. And when you think about it, it's surrounded by water, so every bit of energy that goes into the Isle of Wight goes either on a wire or a pipe or a little bit of solid fuel. So you have complete control over how much energy is going into that community. The EU were absolutely chuffed. We were going to get millions out of the EU to run this, but they needed to know how much energy was being used, for which they had to go to the electricity suppliers and the gas suppliers and the oil suppliers. And as they were all supposed to be in competition with one another now, they all refused to release that information to the government. And the government, having sold off gas and electricity and Brit oil, you remember Tony Benn set up Brit oil to try and get a grip on the oil, having sold that all off, they had no control whatever over those energy industries to supply the information. The EU were horrified, they couldn't believe it, that you couldn't do this, and the whole project was lost. So that marvellous project of an energy action city in the Isle of Wight was lost. We lost millions of EU money for running it, and I think we would have learnt an enormous amount about sustainability and the use of energy. And the other thing I was going to talk about is smart meters. They are very topical at the moment, aren't they? I even noticed that there's lots of things in the papers about smart meters, and that is a classic case of industry suborning a good idea. It all started in the 70s, and in those days they weren't called smart meters, they were called feedback energy meters. And the idea was what a Dutchman who came to see me about it called the log pile and speedo effect. The idea is, it's a clever idea, isn't it, that you had a sort of feedback from your meters that showed you how much energy you paid for or had, how much you used, at any one moment, what was being used. So that, I mean, the gas industry that I work for loved this one, because if you put on a gas fire, you could see on your meter how much it was costing you, and if you put on an electric fire, you could see the fantastic cost of electricity, and this would be a good marketing point. We weren't allowed to say that at the time, but anyway, that's why we were supportive. But this Dutchman had come up with this meter, and it was £15. That's all they needed to produce this meter, this feedback meter. The LSE had done a project over in the United States, which followed on from Dutch work, which showed that if you put a feedback meter into every house in a community, their energy consumption fell by between 20 and 25%, with no capital investment in the properties at all. This was purely behavioural. You can imagine what that did. I was in a privatised gas industry by that time. It's a long time ago, so I can tell you that I was called up into the board level, and the job was to kill this stone dead. So as my department had a very good reputation in energy conservation with a 15 million bill, we were able to kill it stone dead, and it stayed dead in the United Kingdom ever since. But the modern electricity industries, and that means gas and electricity together, are pushing the smart, what they now call the smart meter, which Ernst & Young have now told us will cost £515 per meter in a household instead of the 15. Curiously enough, the biggest suppliers will be in the USA, who own a lot of our industry, IBM, Itron, I don't know if you've heard of Itron, big meter makers, Landis and Jaya from Switzerland. They are going to make a killing out of this because, you know, instead of supplying ordinary gas meters, there'll be electricity £515 a household. And I often ask myself, how did the energy industries, which I am no longer in, manage to persuade the civil servants to swallow this one? When you think for £15 a household, we could cut the domestic energy consumption in this country between 20 to 25% with no capital expenditure. So imagine with capital expenditure, like warm front, green deal, and all that on top, the savings will be enormous.
Well, but is it to do with the fact that they will find more about use of energy down to the minute, and so they can have tariffs that are then targeted for 6 times a day, sort of
That's right.
half time between Coronation Street or the FA Cup final, so your price for electricity will go up at that time if you turn your kettle on.
That's right. And they are selling this one. That's the cui bono again, who's making a killing. So, and isn't it clever? I mean, I am a marketing man, you see, that's my business. They call it the smart meter. Isn't that clever? You know, a smart meter is something positive, something aspirational, better than the man next door. Smart is good. Whereas perhaps eco-feedback is rather a pejorative term, isn't it? So this is a thing to think about on energy policy. You know, this is actually what drives it. And I think somebody has been incredibly clever in the energy industries, I think, on that sort of thing. Those are the 4 projects. Things you might want to talk about now, I thought, because you don't want to hear me rabbiting on like this for ages. Competition. I thought you might want competition in the energy industries. I don't know if it's occurred to you, there is no competition in the energy industries now, because they all sell gas and electricity, and some of them sell oil and coal. And isn't it curious, the prices are all the same. You virtually can't save anything by switching energy suppliers. Before privatisation, the competition in the energy industries was fierce. It really was fierce between gas and electricity and oil and coal. Because we had to, you know, gas had to do it for survival, electricity. And there was real competition. People used to come from abroad, particularly Americans. And remember, Mrs. Thatcher lied to this country when she told them that the United States energy is privately owned and run. That is an actual myth. Most gas and electricity and water in the United States is run through municipally owned undertakings. You know, there are a few small ones privately, but mostly it's municipally owned. And they used to come and see us and really relish, they'd love to be like the nationalised industries of the United Kingdom, where they could have real marketing and real competition. And I was part of the big marketing division in British Gas. Why did we spend £15 million a year on energy conservation? Because it was a gift to a gas industry to sell gas. I can remember going over to France years ago to talk to them about using energy conservation to sell their products. It was quite new to them. And of course I mentioned earlier on, who owns the energy industries in this country now? If you buy your electricity in London, you're owned by EDF, Électricité de France, 80% owned. I can remember, my politics are a little bit to the left actually, aren't they? I can remember, because I had to be politically neutral in my job. I'll tell you a little anecdote. When I retired, I was able to drop the pretense, and I was appointed as chairman of the local Labour Party here. And I was invited by the Association for the Conservation of Energy back to their Christmas party. And the chairman, a chap called Andrew Warren, rushed across the room to me and said, "Robert, congratulations, I hear you've been made chairman of the local Labour Party." And Peter Ross, who'd held the Under-Secretary of State for Energy, was there. And he said, "No, Andrew," he said, "you're wrong. Robert's one of us." And I was able to say to him, "Peter, British Gas paid me a lot of money to make you believe that." And he was like the man in the Bible who went away sorrowing. You know? So, but anyway, as I was saying, I am a little bit to the left. And I used to pose as worried Tory from Essex when I was meeting ministers. Because we in British Gas were losing massive chunks of our industrial and commercial loads to Norsk Hydro, Royal Dutch Shell, Électricité de France, Statoil. And I'd say, these are the nationalised industries of those terrible socialist countries in Europe. You know, what? And then they'd be shocked because they hadn't realised that. So they were taking all our markets and buying it up. It really is, from the politics of energy, you know, that's one to ponder on. You might want to talk about gas use in power stations. Has it ever occurred to you that gas, when I talked about the policy gap, you know, back in the 70s, gas saved this country from actually running out of energy. And we thought at the time that we would have gas right through to the end of this century. And in fact, it's going to run out in about 2020. In the European Union, you're not allowed to sell gas for power generation. Yes. As soon as Thatcher came in, we changed that in this country to allow gas to be sold in power generation. My chairman at the time, Sir Dennis Rook, used to say this is an energy obscenity. You know, to use gas to generate electricity is probably the worst thing you could do. It's probably a stupid idea to use gas for anything other than chemical feedstock, quite frankly. You know, to burn it for cooker heating, central heating, is really, if you think about it, is an energy obscenity. But she allowed gas to be used for power generation, so lots of little businessmen, I wonder which way they vote, you know, were able to set up little companies to burn gas to produce generation, and now what is it, about 60% of our gas, our electricity at the moment is generated by gas, isn't it? I think it's something like that. You know more about this than I do. I think that's what it is. And that was a pure political energy policy decision. The gas gathering, have you ever flown or sailed across the North Sea? If you're in the yachting business, as I sail, sailing across the North Sea at night now is terrifically easy because you've got all these gas flares going off. You noticed, you know, you've got all over the North Sea burning gas off. Back in the, about 20 odd years ago now or more, British Gas wanted to establish the gas gathering project, which was to join up all these oil and gas things that were flaring off gas to take it in. The Thatcher government insisted that if that were done, it had to be done with private money. Whereas British Gas, you had money coming out of our ears, and we were going to do it with our own money. But the Thatcher government would not let it be done without private money in it. And of course, it was a long-term project. They didn't come forward with the money, and so it was never done. And that's a nasty little bit of energy politics, I think. We've been flaring off gas in the North Sea, wasting it ever since. Have you ever wondered why Northern Ireland has no gas? They discovered Kinsale gas. You know, the Southern Irish have got lots and lots of gas in the Kinsale gas fields. And before we were privatised, British Gas had induced them to build a pipeline up to Northern Ireland, and we were going to re-gas Northern Ireland. Gas mains everywhere. Again, the Thatcher government said this can only be done with private money. They wouldn't let the British gas industry raise the money to do it. No banker, you know what incredibly upright, generous, poverty-stricken people they are, they wouldn't put any money into it because Northern Ireland was a bit dodgy in those days. You know, you could get blown up and shot and all that. And so there's a pipeline from Kinsale that goes up to the Northern Irish gas port, as is capped off and has never been used. And that's why poor old Northern Ireland, which desperately needs gas for its industry, has never had gas. That was a political discussion made for money reasons. Have you ever come across log effect gas fires? No. I'm going to finish on that because it's really a marketing point, really. British Gas in the late 70s and early 80s wanted legislation to make it illegal to have log effect gas fires because their efficiency was about 10% and probably minus. You know, a log effect gas fire, burning the gas on the logs, probably sucked all the heat out of your house up the chimney. So although it was, say, 10%, it was probably minus. And British Gas wanted to introduce legislation to make them illegal. Massive lobbying from British manufacturers of them, because little companies could set up and make a mint out of it. And British Gas was stopped doing it by the Thatcher government when they came in. Now, I think that is appalling. And you go into lots of, I'm in the fuel poverty area, you go into a lot of elderly persons' houses now, and they have these wretched log effect gas fires, because they like it, you know, sort of thing. And they have, you know, it's just, their money's just going up the chimney. You know, isn't it extraordinary, that decision made for money on them? So you might want to talk about these things, or the Green Deal. And one or two of you, when I came along, you talked about the Green Deal, talk about that. But I'll conclude, I think, on this. I hope I've given you enough background into how energy policy is not made. I'm seriously suggesting, I said, it's now impossible for the United Kingdom to have a coherent energy policy for the national good, because we have no control over energy supplies, whatever. In the 80s and 90s, some of us used to get fed up with energy, with ministers saying, British Gas, the United Kingdom has an energy policy, which is not to have an energy policy, ha 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 ha. You know, they felt this was a light government. But I think we've got to the stage now where the government could not have an energy policy for the public good because it has no control whatever over energy supply in this country at all. And curiously enough, I was reading a document the other day and came across a bloke called Ludovic Brisket. There's a name to conjure with. He was the clerk to Elizabeth I's Privy Council. And in 1580, he wrote to Walsingham about the political state of Ireland. And he wrote, I made a note of this, because there is now no remedy but to make anew, for to piece the old again would be but labour lost. And I think you could say that today about energy policy. And how any UK government is going to make anew when we don't own any of the energy in this country just astonishes me. So what I was going to suggest, we've now got a few minutes. Anything you want to raise or talk about energy policy, I will do. Thank you.
I think that's great. Open it up time for questions. Just one very quick thing, because I was born on September the 11th, 1973, which is the day AFA was shot. So
Oh, I see, yes, that's right. God.
It's been a chill.
My wife was right, you weren't born when this started.
So, yeah, questions, comments?
It may be off your patch, but I'm thinking about renewables and the current debate about wind farms.
Yeah.
And to what extent it's a rigged business. And being a town planner, this kickback where the wind farm suppliers are saying we don't want to operate in Britain anymore because of the costs and uncertainty of steering things through the planning system. So you have this direct conflict with the government saying, you know, wind farms are the future, we've got to have more and more of them. And other people saying, well, it's a rigged game and the real cost-benefit analysis isn't being done. And then these green activists who do not want wind farms in nice parts of the country where they happen to live. I'm just wondering if you've got any take on that.
Well, curiously enough, the green activists, who can be a pain in the neck in energy conservation and sustainability, are doing the right thing, because I understand that offshore wind is something like 10 times more cost effective than onshore wind. And that building onshore, you don't get, it's to do with the load factors, isn't it? When, if you're a yachting man as I am, you know that as soon as you get a couple of miles offshore, it is always windy. Whereas on onshore wind farms, you often see them standing still. But I think the worst thing, even with offshore wind in this country, 80% of the new installations being put in at the moment are being bought from abroad, which is a problem. Where I spend some of my time in France, where an enormous amount of wind is being put in, onshore wind is being put in at enormous level, the locals are furious because it's all run from Germany. You know, it's, I'm trying to think of the name of the person, but the French have caught on to the fact that they need to have wind. So I don't know if they're right. Something's gone wrong in this country. I heard a guy up in Glasgow who's got trying to get a big wind farm going. He's having trouble with the town planners, actually. You chaps seem to have trouble with wind farms.
It's the public that's the trouble.
But he's got, his idea is that when he's got too much wind, which is like it today, he's actually raising hydrogen with the surplus electricity. And when the wind doesn't blow, he's using the hydrogen to run his generators to provide electricity. And to me that seems, but you don't hear about that, do you? And I'm wondering why. I don't know what is stopping it happening in that way in this country. But it seems to be offshore is the thing to have. But we in this country don't seem to be financing it. And the government, for some reason, are doing some very curious things at the moment. I just don't know, sorry.
There's an interesting question about who makes the money.
Yeah, it is. Who's going to make money?
The wind farm industry is dominated by Denmark and Germany and manufacturers, starting to be China as well. But there is still a lot more money and profit in gas, oil and coal.
Exactly, yeah.
So the competitive landscape and how you invest in planning and how you invest in sort of national infrastructure, the money flows fossil fuel, big industry. And there is still not a consolidated, big enough industry within wind or renewables. There's starting to be Siemens moving into it and others, but it's still fairly fragmented. So it's difficult to get that momentum.
I think you're right, Ali, because when you say, although I'm saying we're going to run out of gas in this country, indigenous gas, will be run out by 2020 here pretty well. There's an enormous amount of gas in the world, really enormous supplies of gas in the world. And there's a lot of money to be made in shipping it around. This country will be shipping gas in, but if you have too much wind power, though it's trivial at the moment, it's less than 5%, isn't it? 2%. Trivial. But if you look at some of the government projections, they're thinking of 15 to 20% of wind. That does make a hole in gas sales and gas electricity generation. Tide power, that amazes me that we don't do tide power. The tides are marvellous because you can predict the tides. They don't stop when the high pressure comes, and yet we hardly do anything.
I had my partner in the mid-70s was doing his PhD on tidal power. We spent a year in Norway doing research on things up fields that bobbed up and down. And it just seems to have gone dead. There's nothing of it now. You don't hear anything about it. People know the technology's there and has been for quite a long time.
There's one in Northern Ireland. What's the name of that big lock?
Nay.
Yes, there's a tidal generation thing in there. And always, if you go to Brittany, people forget about the River Ronce, where the French have had tidal power there for more than 60 years, maybe 70 years. It's extraordinary, done.
Well, for example, you're investing in one tidal demonstration.
One whole tidal power.
Pembroke, St David's wants to be completely renewables based on one power station.
So when I was still on the Advisory Council for Energy Conservation, we put up a proposal for the Severn barrage, because we reckoned that the energy gap was still there, and the Advisory Council advised government to build a barrage across the Severn to produce energy from the tide. This is an idea of politics. The electricity industry at the time, nuclear, opposed this tooth and nail, and a report came out, and the government swallowed it. We will not build a Severn barrage because it will only produce 10% of the country's electricity. 2 weeks after that, another report came out from the nuclear people wanting the new nuclear power stations because they would produce up to 10%. So the Severn barrage was slung out on less than 10%, and the wretched nuclear got their money because they would get up to 10%. And at the same time, we were not going to give up. We knew that the second Severn crossing, although it's only just been done, right back then it was still in people's minds. And we said, look, if you built this properly, you could have road and rail across it easily. I found this hard to believe because I was part of the team trying to push this through. And we were told by the Department of Energy, you cannot consider that, said the Humphrey, because this is a matter for the Department of Transport. Isn't it extraordinary that you could not put that into the equation because, oh, you belong to the Energy Department and that's transport. Can you understand why I despair of politics sometimes, you know? It's extraordinary. I used to run a course for the Institute of Management on working with Whitehall. And one of the things in it was never have anything to do with politicians or ministers. Spend all your money on suborning civil servants, because that's where the decisions are made. So, they're the ones who count. Yes?
Yeah, well, I was interested in talking a bit more about smart meters.
Yes.
Perhaps, because as I see it, there's really, well, the way I look at it, there are sort of two different issues. There's the one which is around energy monitoring and feedback, as you say, with somebody having a display in their home, and then whether that influences people to reduce their energy use. And I actually read something, I think, once where an even bigger effect is seen if people are paying for it, on, you know, pay as you go.
Pay as you go, yes.
Some people are on pay as you go meters anyway, but even if you had, pay as you go, that makes a big difference as well. But and then the second side of it, so that's energy monitoring. The second side is this issue about whether if the energy companies can see what you're using immediately, then they can try and encourage people, for example, to use energy overnight, like running washing machines overnight, because then we could make a huge saving by balancing out our load over the 24 hours. And that, obviously, that I think is all tied in with having a smarter grid system as well, and perhaps that's why the cost is so increased with that, because that's a huge infrastructure upgrade for the whole country, really, to have that kind of system in place.
And cui bono again, and all that. Once you put the smart meters in, you don't need meter readers. You never have to come and call on your house and read the meters, which is a very expensive activity. Why we read meters in this country, I don't know. In most of the South American countries, you can only pay for your gas and electricity on monthly budget billing. You know, you say this is what it's going to cost you. And it often struck me as that's the way to do it. You know, reading meters and all that is fearsomely expensive. Most of the gas escapes that are reported in this country come from meters. Because when you think on the whole system, the only thing that's moving and breaking is the wretched meter. And if you have slot meters, putting money or cards in, you're moving it again, and you get gas leaks. You know, if you're running a gas industry, you don't want domestic customers, they're fearsomely expensive, it's better to sell them. But also you don't want meters, they cause gas escapes. And for gas escapes, you have to have fitters who cost a lot of money. Nothing is the way you think it is. This is another thing on energy policy. This has nothing whatever to do with energy policy. But in the late 60s, they had 3 enormous explosions in Barcelona. And they blew up some blocks of flats and killed people. Now that does upset people. When you kill people with gas, people get pretty upset about it. And because they're under Napoleonic law, the chairman and the chief engineer of the gas industry is immediately arrested and put into prison. The British gas engineers, in solidarity, agreed to help Barcelona Gas. And I was in a planning department at the time, put on that. And I sat on this committee. I'd only ceased to be a graduate trainee in those days, so I was and I heard all these gas engineers talking. They were trying to find out what the technical reason was for these 3 big explosions that had killed a lot of people. And it was quite interesting to hear the physics and chemistry. And then somebody said something that struck me. All 3 explosions had been reported by somebody cycling across Barcelona to the gas industry's offices to report the gas escape, because they had no telephone system and system to reporting gas escapes by telephone. So instead of gas escapes being reported immediately and dealt with, quarter of an hour, half an hour had gone past. So the problem had nothing to do with physics or chemistry or mechanics. It was a behavioural problem of the organisation. And I can remember 30 years after that advising Indian gas companies who were trying to set up, and my advice to them, which I got told off for, because there was a lot of consultancy money to be made on domestic gas, I told them, for heaven's sake, don't set up domestic gas. Just sell your gas to industry and commerce, because if you want domestic gas, you've got to set up this whole infrastructure for safety. And they went away, and I'm afraid I got it in the neck for saying that, because we used to make a lot of money in consultancy. So nothing, I say that on energy policy, nothing is the way you think it is. That's why I don't think gas engineers or physicists ought to be in charge of the energy industry.
I agree with that. Thank you. I think we are running out of time.
Yes, that's right. I hope that's been useful.
Very interesting. Thank you. We wouldn't have guessed that you were slightly left-wing.
I wasn't when I was in it, you know. I pretend not to be.
So let's say thank you to Robert and thank you.
And please do help yourself to some more food or cake, especially.